Okay, so I guess it's PSA time. Last week we discussed our impressions of AMD's FSR3 frame generation technology at Gamescom. We saw a couple of demos there. It was looking quite promising, albeit with certain, dare I say it, caveats.
Yeah, holla.
um, but yeah, basically, it's now become sort of common knowledge that FSR3 is going to be sort of open source, which means it will work on anything, which means it works on the consoles. And man, this has caused a tsunami of questions and misconceptions, and I believe it's called hopium. Uh, yeah, let's go through some. I mean, we got a big bunch of questions. I'm just going to rattle through them, and then we can talk about it. This one from Darjarko. Another happy half fortnight, gents. With the prospect of PS5 Pro seemingly inevitable now, and the recent revelations surrounding FSR 3.0 on consoles, doesn't it seem likely that Sony will be working closely with AMD to essentially build the spec around FSR on console? Could we perhaps call the PS5 Pro the PS5 FSR edition? What evidence can you see of this in the specs that have leaked? Also, do you think it will use the same detachable drive solution as the PS5? Not slim, well, who knows on that one. Aomin 1984. Will devs be able to achieve 60 FPS more often on consoles with FSR3? This one from Garfield. Do you think studios will go back and update their cross-gen lineup, which are already at 60 FPS, with FSR3 to enable a potential 4K 120 target? There are so many last-gen games, racing ones especially, that would definitely benefit from it, I suppose. This one from Kellen Sandifer. Wow. Hey DFT, Richard, in brackets, God.
Sod.
Not God, Zod. Yeah. Alex got there before me. John, in brackets, Jedi Knights, Performant Console King. Alex, Sith Lord of the PC Master Race.
Oh no.
Oh no.
Yeah, we've got issues with the whole Master Race thing. Anyway, if I recall, the series consoles have machine learning capabilities. Will this help with new technologies like FSR3? So basically, I think people have sort of taken the ball and run with it in all sorts of different directions. And the topic heading that I've put on the docket is in block capitals. Stop getting console FSR3 wrong.
Yeah, really.
Alex?
Gosh.
Yeah, we don't want Alex to lose his hair from pulling it out in frustration.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things. All those questions, they are spoken in earnest, I'm presuming. And the whole thing is, I just want to reference to see why there needs to be a reality check about FSR3 and consoles, is that AMD put actually out a recommended specs for AMD's FSR3. And the supported line is RX 5700 and above, but the recommended is RX 6000 series and above. That should tell you actually quite a bit, because in terms of like performance differential, like 5700 XT is kind of what I'd put that PlayStation 5 performance level in, and RX 6000 series is better than something like a PlayStation 5 or usually Xbox Series X, like when you get into that 6800 class. AMD is already trying to manage expectations about FSR3 in terms of where it becomes the quality input latency, which they haven't even talked about at all yet, which is a whole nother thing I'll just talk about soon. They have certain quality expectations of it, so they want to expectations managed before it comes out. Don't expect it to be great for all hardware in all situations. So they're already doing that, and we already say, oh, consoles probably don't fit into that performance bracket necessarily anyways, which is their recommended spec for FSR3. Secondly, during our conversation with them, Nick Tibiros did mention that it has a variable performance cost, which was semi-high already on a 7900 XTX. If you scale that down to a GPU that is probably less than half as powerful, like you see in the PlayStation 5, well, then you start running into issues of actually having it be viable to be done in real time without dramatically making performance worse. There's that, and there's also the fact that they have really yet to talk about how they're going to manage FSR3's input latency. They've talked about anti-lag plus, I think, to other outlets, and there seems to be a driver solution from AMD, which might be limited to their current set of cards, as in the 7000 series cards, and is a per game basis, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. It being limited to the current set of cards, that's quite a lot there. So, and there's a lot of mitigating factors there that say actually we shouldn't expect too much for FSR 3 on consoles in general already. But one of the big things that there's a couple of these questions that have come out, and all the comments that I see under the videos and also on Twitter and elsewhere, is that people think you can use FSR 3, let alone DLSS 3, to get a game up that was targeting 30 FPS to 60 FPS. And boy, oh boy, for most games out there, you would definitely not want to play that game at that FSR 3 experience. AMD themselves say the baseline performance experience that they want is is like a game that already runs comfortably at 60 FPS.
Yep. Then
you could take it higher with FSR 3. And that isn't the case for all games, especially ones that are targeting next generation features, UE5, whatever your Jedi Survivors are, etc. So I would say there's so many different factors that say FSR 3 is actually right now a very PC focused feature, because it's a response to DLSS 3, that if we get FSR 3 on the PS5 or Xbox Series X, then it will be a pretty rare situation indeed, based upon everything we know so far.
They were talking, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, because my memory isn't so good on this one, but they were talking about the 7900 XTX dealing with 4K FSR 3.
Right.
I think they were talking about something like, what was it, 1.9 to 4 milliseconds, depending on how occupied the async compute pipelines are.
I think it was specifically 1.4 to 1.7 milliseconds. And so that's a lot. That's depending upon the async occupancy of what they were seeing. That means that technically it might actually, since we didn't get actually a firm number there of how much it actually costs without asynchronous occupancy, because that's another interesting thing about this. Like on that big GPU, there was enough of a gap while something was occurring that asynchronous compute could run and shave off a good amount of the time there. But what if asynchronous compute is already tapped out, which in a console game, you actually might expect it to be, because they have a much more fine-grained understanding of what GPU they're up against and how they can schedule things. And also like the amount of time it takes to do a shadow pass or something like that. They may actually already have that tapped out on consoles. So the cost could be potentially even higher and worse than I've mentioned just up until this point. So there's a lot of things, like Rich has just said, like that get in the way of this actually being very viable, I would say, currently, based upon everything we know, for PS5 and Xbox Series X. PS5 Pro, though, is such a big question mark that I really couldn't say too much about it, actually.
I'd be extremely surprised if they built a console around FSR. And when they're talking about, I mean, the leak mentioned an 8K performance mode, and 8K tops out at 60 hertz, so it's no use there.
Yeah,
because 30 to 60 on an 8K image would be, monstrous even for the XTX, I'd imagine.
Yeah, really.
So, yeah, just to quickly answer some of these questions. Will devs be able to achieve 60 FPS more often on consoles with FSR 3? No, for the reasons stated, because it's got its own computational cost that could be quite significant on a console. Do you think studios will go back and update their cross-gen lineup, which were at 60 with FSR 3, to enable a potential 4K 120 target? The other thing to bear in mind is that FSR 3 leans heavily into FSR 2, needs it for the motion vector data, so that cross-gen lineup would actually kind of need to have FSR2 in it as well. So that's not an insignificant integration to add in from scratch. So I don't think so. The machine learning capabilities of the series consoles, it doesn't use machine learning, as to the best of my ability.
No.
So it's not going to help. So yeah, I mean, you get an idea of the kind of sort of elevated expectations that there have been for FSR 3 on the consoles. It will run on it, to be clear, because it's fundamentally it's a compute thing, right? It will run on any GPU. The question is how effective it would be, and 4K might be out of reach. Possibly lower resolutions could be more viable. The other thing, of course, is the whole lag situation, how you mitigate latency. If you play, even if you could get 30 up to 60, we've seen what DLSS 3 with VSync was like.
Yeah. That's another thing.
with
VSync,
latency,
right?
and it was
Like,
it was really bad.
so like DLSS 3, once again, we don't have FSR 3 on our hands. We still have, there's so many questions about how it's going to latency mitigate exactly, but we know for DLSS 3, it's integrating reflex. And if you're playing with reflex on like a 4K 120 hertz panel, you're not actually playing the game at 120 FPS. You're playing at like 116, 117 FPS. It's utilizing VRR to latency mitigate. So if FSR 3 follows a similar path, that would mean to actually have the experience that you want people to play with, it would require a VRR screen.
Yep.
Okay.
I don't know how many devs would do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of these kind of interesting conjectures, which the practical application of which is going to be extremely challenging. And guess we'll just have to wait and see on that one.